Thanks, Julie. And going now to Rushanara, we are informed that there will certainly be at least one division at about 4 o'clock. So we'll look out for that in a few minutes. But over to Rushanara. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and apologies that I wasn't able to be here for the whole meeting. I had another urgent meeting that I needed to attend to. I wanted to focus on just transitions and also risk issues. And just to start off with, my initial questions are for Sandy and for Sekar. BP CEO Bernard Looney announced in February 2020 that the oil and gas giants would reinvent themselves for the green era. But we know that their future is not necessarily going to be bound up in the same way with net zero as for others, at least not in their current form. So what would be the impact on regional economies and jobs of that transition? And how do you think we need to approach this to ensure that there's a just transition? Because already we're seeing differential impacts. We've seen some of the demonstrations in France in terms of the protests. We are starting to see, certainly in constituencies like mine, some of the positive changes that are being made then having a knock-on effect. For instance, if you're a cabbie in my constituency, you're caught between a rock and a hard place between some of the changes and the impact on your wages immediately. So what do you think we need to do? And I'm giving you a micro example around some of those issues and the costs of transition, how we approach those issues. And apologies if there's any repetition, don't repeat, just add to what you've been saying.
Would you like to start with Sekar or myself? Sekar, would you like?
Can I have a go and then I'll hand on to you? So let's start with the basics. A just transition is a necessary risk mitigation of that move. It just is common sense, and it extends beyond our shores. Unless we have a just transition in countries that border Europe to ensure that they mitigate the move towards a low carbon economy, we're going to have a massive pressure coming from immigration, which is going to have its own effect on our own economies and our own social cohesion and so on. Yeah. Within our own economies, you're absolutely right, Rushanara, that there is an issue here. And the cabbie is a beautiful small example. Does the cabbie invest in £65,000 for a brand new electric cab, which is a lot of money, in the midst of a COVID crisis in which she cannot, in fact, find the fares to pay for it? And then where is the infrastructure? And then how does she cope with that as the shift goes? And I think that's where we have to ensure that as we move forward in this, in terms of investments, and as companies like BP change their model, as we invest in infrastructure, side by side, government action is taken to ensure that particularly the more vulnerable in society are actually protected from this, and that we invest enough in alternative employment and income streams that ensures that they have a just transition, so that the divisions that we know exist in our country do not become wider still. Sandy,
over to you.
Yes, no, I would echo what Sekar said, and just taking the example of a big company that needs to make that kind of a transition. There are losers in terms of people who will lose employment, and there are winners, people who might get the opportunity to work in a new renewable sphere. So clearly, it first behooves the company to think about how they can create employment opportunities associated with renewable energy. But then thinking about people who are going to be displaced and lose their livelihood in the context of this transition, I think there's two ways to think about that. The first is increasingly what we see, and I think the COVID crisis has made this incredibly clear, companies do understand that as they manage this transition, they have a social license with their all of their stakeholders, and that they need to think about how do they manage that transition from a private sector perspective as best as they can in terms of appropriate arrangements for workers who lose employment, thinking about retraining, thinking about redeployment. So I do think there's a private sector responsibility. On the public sector side, and Sekar talked about a variety of mechanisms that could be brought in, one of the key questions is, of course, how do you pay for that? And I know one of the things that the UK is thinking about is what is the right kind of an emissions tax program that you might set up. And so there's an interesting question about, is there a funding mechanism that can help with the just transition? Obviously, the emissions structure, and I'm not an expert on these structures, but it would need to be one that would bite, that would actually be relevant in facilitating the transition, but then it may fund some beneficial reinvestment in some of those who are most displaced. But I think it will be a very difficult time, and coming on the back of the COVID crisis, not easy.
Okay. So just on financing, and others may want to come in on this. With the International Energy Agency estimating about 3.5 trillion being needed to be invested in the global energy sector each year up to 2050, how much transition finance is needed to transition the whole economy, do you think? And how should governments be approaching these sorts of big number challenges to meet the target, both in terms of the medium term as well as long term? Because it seems to me that I think successive governments tend to be good at making commitments to the long term, but then when you look carefully, we all fall short across different countries of meeting the year to year kind of medium term target as well.
Well, I could certainly respond with the idea that I do think that it needs to be perhaps publicly seeded, but private capital must be the solution here. So, clearly that all governments right now have had to go into an unprecedented financial deficit position in the context of the COVID crisis. So there's no way that the public sector can sort of magically finance this incredible multi-trillion investment challenge. Where I do think the opportunity lies, though, is, and one of the others mentioned this earlier, I think it was Steve, talked about a green national bank or a green infrastructure bank. The European Investment Bank structure was quite constructive. And where I think public finance can be most helpful is in turbocharging or seeding bigger projects, mobilizing some of that private capital. So thinking about a structure where the public might take guarantee positions or might take pieces of investments that aren't appealing to a typical private sector investor, that is an opportunity. But the other thing then is, Hugh has just told us about, locked up capital that's waiting to do infrastructure investment. So that's one angle. Okay. I've mentioned this long-term fund. So it's really trying to think about those steps, the Green Investment Bank, Solvency II, the long-term asset fund.
So that's brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to bring in Steve, and for Hugh, in terms of the point that was made about what you said, are those interventions likely to be adequate between Green Investment Banks, EIB, and other institutions, and releasing funds to meet that challenge and those big numbers? Steve first, then Hugh.
Thank you, Ms. They're necessary but not sufficient. So I agree with all of the suggestions that have been made. We need to be thinking even bigger, bolder than this, though, given the pace and scale of the challenge. If we are to decarbonise at 7.6% per annum between now and 2050, this is a very, very big ask. So I think we touched before on COP and the opportunity that offers, as well as the G7 and G20 with the two co-hosts. The need for the green finance strategy, which was cutting edge at the time. It's now a few years old in terms of when it was prepared and written, not published. I think it's time already to update it. I was on the task force that helped write that, or advised those that were writing it. We were not allowed to look at fiscal measures. So we now need to revisit that. Just as Sandra was saying, fiscal is absolutely key here. And what we now have in Europe, we have the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, we have a Green New Deal, and we have an investment plan for that Green Deal. We don't have the equivalent documents in the UK yet. We don't have a plan. What we need to do is set out, here is the nationally determined contribution, which has been done. What specific infrastructure needs to be built? What is that going to cost? Where it actually produces revenues, it can be securitized. So how will it be securitized? To whom? What asset classes? Which asset owners? What's the plan? If it was a company, it would have a capital raising plan. Yep. And where it can't be securitized, let's imagine it's a dam, for example, which doesn't generate revenues, not directly, then it needs to be funded through the state, through gilts and perhaps green bonds. And having a structured approach to that, a plan which is delivered and monitored, is missing. Europe is now ahead of us, and I hate to say that, but it's true.
Great. Hugh, do you want to come in?
Just to, I think, frame it, I agree with what's been said. I think to frame it as being that this is about what government can enable as well as what government has to do. Some of it government has to fund, but it's not all about saying if only the government would write a huge check, then everything would be solved. I mentioned earlier how Flood Re happened because the government enabled it, but the insurers paid for it. Here, what we're talking about, the government can issue sovereign debt for which it is, very adequately invested in at an effective cost to the taxpayer. It can enable insurance investment through reform of Solvency II. It can enable a much greater and more productive use of capital through an investment bank to mirror the EIB, as Sandy was outlining. There are a number of things here wrapped up in a revised green finance strategy, as Steve talked about, where the government can enable so much that can come from the private sector to happen. But at the moment, because financial services is so regulated, there are all sorts of constraints and guardrails which have to be moved out of the way.
Yeah, thank you. Chair, can I carry on for a few more minutes, or do we come back?
Yes, we'll come back, Rushanara. So if I could ask everybody, do stay logged on. Don't log off, just stay logged on. And I will suspend the committee now for between 15 and 25 minutes, depending upon whether...
I'll save my killer questions till afterwards.
More killer questions. So,
thank you.
Committee for between 15 and 25 minutes. Order. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for bearing with us. We've just had our division in the House of Commons, so we're now recommencing the committee hearing, and I'm going to ask Rushanara to continue with her questions, please.
Great, thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to focus on a couple of specific questions, and this one is for Sandra. In one of the hearings, I raised some issues around investment in fossil fuels, and I wondered if you could take us through some of that. So your chairman, Sir Larry Fink, told CEOs in a letter this year that we will be increasingly disposed to vote against management and board directors when companies are not making sufficient progress on sustainability-related disclosures. So can you talk us through what your criteria for making such a move is, and when that will start in practice? Because you will be aware perhaps that and something I raised in in one of those sessions is about the story that came out related to the investment in that is doing damage to the Amazon and deforestation scandals and so on. So if you could just talk through, and I know, I mean, this is a slightly awkward question, but it needs to be addressed. If you could talk us through those two areas, I'd be very grateful.
Certainly. So yes, Larry announced in January of 2020 that we were putting sustainability at the heart of everything that we do, stewardship being one of those things. So what we did this year in stewardship was we asked companies to report using the TCFD framework as well as SASB aligned metrics. The TCFD framework we selected because you have to actually manage climate risk in your governance, in your risk management. You need to have strategy, you need to have metrics in order to produce a disclosure. And what we did is we identified 400 companies that we thought were the most carbon intensive in our portfolio. We've had extensive engagement already, so 1,200 engagements on environmental and climate issues this year. And in doing that, we focused in on whether we felt that companies had made sufficient progress as a function of where they ought to be from an industry perspective, but also dialogue that we had had to date. This only came out in January. And immediately what we did in this voting season was two things. One was we took 61 votes, it was 55 companies, but we said these companies are not yet doing as much as we think they should be doing. And either we voted against directors, we voted in favor of shareholder proposals. So we were the first company to really use voting against directors as a lever, because that's a tool that we have, across all of our markets. Shareholder proposals tend to be isolated in a few countries, particularly the US. The second thing we did was we created a watch list of 191 companies and said, these companies are ones that they're not yet meeting our expectations. We will wait until the end of 2020. If we're not satisfied with what we're seeing, then we'll consider voting against them in the next year. So these companies are all very attentive to the dialogue that they're having with us and with other investors of their need to manage climate risk. So we think that's been, a real sign of the commitment that we've shown. You asked a second question about deforestation. And there we do have an explicit policy around deforestation. We engage actively in countries such as Brazil, countries in Southeast Asia on deforestation. Almost all the companies where we have investments are controlled by either state actors or family actors. So we're very much a minority investor. What we do is we use the influence that we do have, even though we're a small investor. So we do two things. One is obviously engaging with those companies, which we've done on multiple occasions. Secondly, often voting against directors. So particularly in Brazil, there are several situations where we vote against directors. But then also we're looking to what are the multinational companies doing as far as deforestation. So there was an announcement today of the Procter & Gamble vote where they were facing a deforestation related proposal having to do with palm kernel oil. And that was one where we voted in favor of the shareholder proposal because we felt this was a company that had a high expectation from society, from its stakeholders in terms of what they were doing as far as sourcing palm oil, and didn't feel that they had quite met our expectations.
But you're a major player. You're not a minor player, along with Vanguard, State Street, and others who are named in the reports that came out last year. Do you feel what you're doing is sufficient to address it? Of course, there's a kind of government to government level dimension to all of this, but do you feel you, along with other companies, are doing enough to get a grip on these sorts of issues? Because the Amazon contributes 20% of oxygen to the world, and there are grave concerns here. And if we are to have confidence that the private sector is playing the right role, right kind of role, using all your might and influence and your finances alongside government, and there's plenty to criticize governments about, both in Europe but also in the emerging economies. Do you feel you're doing enough? Is this enough, what you're doing?
When I look at what we and other investors are doing on climate change, I feel very happy about the progress because I feel that the private expectations that we're setting, and look, there's much more to do, so don't get me wrong, but there's much more to do, but we're also moving in a direction that increasingly governments are moving in as well. So I feel like that private-public partnership is working. What's more challenging is when we're operating in a country environment where the rules and regulations and the enforcement of those rules and regulations are not something that we can count on as we would in the developed world.
So why invest? Why invest? Why play? Why not walk away? Is what you're doing enough to save the planet?
Well,
I think I want to ask that question to others as well.
So right now, our holdings in the sort of companies that you're referring to where deforestation is a major risk for the business model in some of these developed countries, those are typically in index investing. So a client says, I would like to invest in index XYZ, that contains a holding. And when they do that, then we're contracted to invest in that company on behalf of the client. The client makes the decision, that's the index that they choose, and we then need to match the index. So there's two things that we can do there. Three things. One is we can talk to all of our clients about sustainable investing and suggest products that screen out some of the kind of companies that you're talking about. The second thing we can do is we can engage with the companies and see if we're able to have influence using whatever influence skills we have. The third thing, though, is actually working with the index providers. So when we find that there are companies that increasingly clients don't want to own, index providers have the ability to remove companies in their index-related products. So we're really working on all of those levers in order to have the effect that you're looking for.
Steve, I noticed you wanted to speak, and Sekar. Is enough being done to save the planet?
Thank you, Isai. No, it isn't. And collectively, even fund managers, even if we all work together, as many of us are, those of us here are working together, even if we all work together, we cannot replace government action.
Yeah.
We need to work in concert together with government to create, if you like, the transition, to power the transition through engagement, through our vote, but also to correct the market failures. At the moment, even though there are 1,800 policies around the world on climate risk alone, we clearly are still heading towards a 4-degree future much more rapidly than a 2 or a 1.5. It remains the world's biggest market failure. The corrections that we need really do stem from the treasuries and the finance ministers around the world. We can help and support that. But with the, I'm very proud of our engagement record. We go back to 2001 on climate voting. And just to gently correct something that Sandy said earlier, we have been taking voting action on the re-election of board members as well since 2008. And a colleague of mine, David Cumming, the CIO for Equities, he was speaking to the Brazilian Environment Minister a few weeks ago with other investors too, raising our concern about, as you put it, the lungs of the planet, and what is clearly a suboptimal situation, an extremely poor situation. We all know about the species loss and the environmental degradation, whether it's fisheries or agriculture, and this kind of abyss of unsustainable economic growth that we face. We cannot address that by ourselves. That is why the green finance strategy is so incredibly important.
Rushanara, thank you. Oh, sorry, I think Seika, sorry, we were going to Seika, weren't we? And then
yeah, I'll be very brief and maybe a little bit controversial. I mean, I'm completely supportive of what Steve said, obviously, and of what Sandra said, but let me be a little bit controversial. Look, the world pool of developed world savings is something between 70 and 80 trillion dollars, roughly speaking. That actually is already out there anyway. So you're not generating new capital. When people buy and sell shares, you're not allocating capital, you're simply buying and selling shares. The only thing, and by the way, and a lot of the companies that you buy shares on actually create the capital, be they banks or be they other instruments that create it. The only instrument you've got in your hand is the ability to convince them that it's special madness not to decarbonize quickly. That's the only thing you can. There is another, I want to bring back to just transition. There's another danger about deforestation that we have to be careful of. Somebody mentioned carbon credits earlier. There's a danger that we end up in trying to meet the carbon credits in the developed world, going into the developing world and imposing tree planting effectively with little regard for local communities. So we feel good about what we've done, but in the process, we haven't been entirely fair to local communities, particularly in West Africa where this might be happening. So it is a complex one, and I agree with Steve. This is one in which all of us should take a position, and all of us have to acknowledge nobody's doing enough at this stage if we're going to avert what might happen.